Welcome to the Landlord Profitability Playbook Podcast, where we share the best practices we use to help our residential real estate investor clients automate their rent collection and get on with their lives. Check out the show notes at www.landlordprofitabilityplaybookpodcast.com. This show is brought to you by Roost Real Estate Co. Property Management. To learn more about our company and the services we provide, visit www.managewithroost.com. Now, here's your host, Chris McAllister.
Chris McAllister here with the Landlord Profitability Playbook, where it's my job to create and coach business opportunities and strategies that support and add value to the lives of real estate investors. I'm here today with my good friend and podcast partner, Laci LeBlanc. And today we're going to continue our discussion about the concept of the neighborhood standard and how it relates to deciding what sort of amenities you could consider or not consider to add to your residential rental properties.
Yes, this is a good one. This is like every episode of Flip This House, Chris, but like with a twist. So you have to come up with your budget and your plan for the house. You have to do all the work. You have to navigate the inevitable problems you find behind the walls.
Right.
It's always my favorite part. But in this case, it's a home that you have to market and sell over and over again to renters for years to come. So there's this big consideration that most of these, really cool Flip This House shows online or on TV don't consider. So it's these decisions have a lot more weight in some cases. So very exciting.
Yeah, if you're crunching the numbers and you're trying to figure out how much to pay for an investment property, if you're considering a new purchase, you have to consider how much money you're going to need to put in on top of the purchase price for any necessary upgrades or amenities. And that's a different calculation than just budgeting, a certain amount of reserves for ongoing repairs, like we discussed in our last episode. And the key here is the trick on this to maintain profitability is only add the amenities that are common to the neighborhood that you're going to buy in. And those are the only amenities that you can expect to get a return on your investment, right? I mean, if you're talking about putting a jacuzzi tub into a neighborhood where, everything's a stand-up shower, that neighborhood is never going to command a premium because you put a jacuzzi tub in. It's a real simplistic example, but it's something you have to keep mindful of, that you only want to be adding amenities to properties that are going to get you a return on your investment. And you have to let the neighborhood, dictate your amenity budget.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And This is a tough one, right? Because for a lot of folks who are in the financial position to own investment properties, right? We don't necessarily live in the neighborhoods that we own those properties in. And so it can be kind of battle of the wills. You want to put stuff in that you think would be great, that, you would like to have, but the neighborhood standard just doesn't always command it or allow for it.
Exactly. If you have a property in a neighborhood that rents, for $2,000 a month or $3,000 a month, that's a whole different environment, a whole different set of considerations than if you have a property in a neighborhood where the rents are closer to, $700, $800, $900 a month.
Yeah. Assuming you want to make money, and that's why you're doing it.
Yeah, if you want to make money, that's
true. If you don't want to make any money, there's a whole different conversation. That's another podcast entirely.
So one of the things that, one of the strategies for what your personal investment strategy might be, there's this concept out there in the world called BRRR, and it's BRRR. I think it's 4 R's. And what it stands for is buy for the B, rehab, rent, refinance, and repeat. And the BRRR method, it's an investment approach that involves rehabbing a distressed property. Obviously, the trick is finding a distressed property at the right price, but you rehab it, you rent it out, and then you go to the bank and you get a cash out refinance on it. And that money allows you to go buy your next property. So the trick on any BRRR is that, first of all, you've got to buy it at such a price. So say you find this house for, $100,000 or whatever, and you've got to put 50 in it to bring it up to the neighborhood standard. And the trick on this is that it would appraise, let's say, for 200, right? So you buy it for 100, you fix it up for 50, and it appraises for 200. And let's say that you get a 75% loan to value and you get to borrow 75% of 200,000 from your bank, that would give you $150,000 back from the bank using the BRRRR method to get your money back for the purchase and the rehab. And you could take that money and go on to the next property. But of course, if you're not making good decisions as far as how far you're going to take that rehab, if you're not making the right financial decisions as to how much you're going to put into the rehab, of course, then that could jeopardize that BRRRR opportunity.
Yeah, that reminds me of the video we just recorded, which was about your investment strategy, your real estate investment strategy, and how important it is to have one. But this is a great example, I think, of a strategy to make money doing this and be very intentional about it. Do you have an example of this kind of, like a real life story for us to kind of illustrate these points? Because I know that.
Yeah, I've been working with. Yeah, well, I've been working with one of our owners in Columbus the past few days, and he has a 5-unit. It's 5 connected townhouses close to the inner city in Columbus, and I think 4 of them are 2 bedrooms, and 1 is a 3 bedrooms. And it's a C or D neighborhood, I guess people would refer to it as. I mean, it's got some opportunities in the neighborhood. Let's just say that. So he bought the house. Let me get sure I get my numbers straight, but I think he bought the house for $180,000, or the property, 5 units for $180,000. And he put a little over $100,000 in the house. So he had to redo some kitchens and appliances and bathrooms and electric. I mean, he did a lot of work, fix up the parking area, things like that. We've been working with him on managing that property since he bought it in, I guess it was 2020. And we finally got it to the point where, it's stable, fully rented, everything's fixed, and so on. So what he's thinking of doing is cashing out that property. So let me back up. So he's got 180 he bought it for, right? He put $100,000 in it. And if we were to put it on the market today, I'm pretty confident, based on the comparables and on the financials, that property will command roughly $450,000, right?
Wow.
It'll sell for that, but it would also appraise for that. So the cool thing is, and from a BRRRR perspective, is if you take that $450,000, and let me just check my math one more time, but if you have $450,000, and let's say your bank is willing to give you 75% of that as a cash out refinance, he's going to get $337,500 in his pocket. I mean, there's closing costs and things like that. But if you take that $337,500 and you subtract out the $280 he put in it, he's not only going to get his money back, he's going to walk away with over $50,000 that he can put towards his next property. So that is a beautiful, BRRRR example. So does that make sense? I think that
illustrates. Yeah, that really illustrates the point perfectly. And I love the thinking, which is you could cash out of that property, right? You could sell it for $450, but depending on your investment strategy, you could also take that cash out refinance, and like you said, you've got your money back, and then you've got extra to put towards that next property.
Absolutely. And the cool thing was, in this case, again, it's a lower end property. So, these units don't have air conditioning. There's no dishwashers or anything like that. I mean, they are basic, functional, safe, livable units. So when he redid the kitchens, he did them to the neighborhood standard. He did install new appliances, but obviously they were, super builder basic appliances. And the other cool thing about this property is, when you don't have air conditioning and things like dishwashers or garbage disposals, the ongoing maintenance costs every month tend to be less too. So again, that's the critical point of not adding amenities above and beyond the neighborhood standard, because it's going to cost you money down the line as well to maintain those, right? But he is giving these tenants in this price range exactly what they're paying for. He's offering fantastic value in the neighborhood, and he's being compensated adequately, right? He's making his numbers, and perfectly appropriately. He's not gouging any. He's not overcharging anybody. He doesn't have excessive tenant turn because he's asking too much rent. It's pretty much textbook. And he didn't try to, over improve. He did what he had to do with plumbing. He changed out fixtures he had to do, fixed water heaters and so forth. And he did a great job, and he's sitting pretty. I'm so happy for him that this worked out for him. Just a textbook example.
Yeah, I think this is something that my family, who's been in real estate for, since before I was born, has always done really well. And I've lived in some of their properties as before I bought my own home, and they've always been safe and secure and clean and maintained, but they've never been too nice for the neighborhood. Hopefully Nana's not listening, but I might even call some of them a little outdated, but they rent fast. People stay for a long time for the most part, and they get the same rent as other properties in the area. And I think that was just part of their strategy. So the neighborhood standard to me is this, it's like if you're listening to this, right, as an investor, this is the golden rule.
Yeah,
like it comes into play when you're buying, when you're selling, when you're rehabbing, when you're maintenance, like all of it. So talk to me about like the neighborhood standard and amenities and how you can kind of frame your upgrades or your renovations or just your maintenance in general by the neighborhood standard and what that means.
Yeah, well, like we've said, many times now, neighborhood standard comes into play almost every element of rehabbing and maintaining, and especially amenities. When I first started, I think I bought my first rental property, I guess it's 22 years ago now. I tried to do that I wanted to do, and I tried to make decisions based on what I thought other people would appreciate based on what I thought I would appreciate as a tenant. And, that's just the wrong way to think about it, right? I'm not building this rental property for me. I'm building it for, my prospective tenant. And I didn't even think about, I didn't even try to put myself in the shoes of a prospective tenant and what's important to them and what they expect. I completely disregarded that. And it was sadly all about me. And, I fell into the trap of wanting to buy, appealing amenities. And, some of them were just stupid, right?
Oh, please give me an example. I can't wait to hear this.
mini blinds in a low-end property. Where I was talking to an owner we have in Springfield, Dennis, yesterday, and he says, mini blinds have gone from $10 to $36. Do I have to put in mini blinds? No, you don't. And the thing is, if you've got 10 windows, it's $360 every time you lose a tenant. Maybe you don't add mini blinds, right? Now, there was another argument at one point where we said, okay, let's maybe put mini blinds in the first floor so that if, people who maybe want to steal something from the house or damage the house are less likely to do so if they can't see what's in there. So you put mini blinds. But, but even mini blinds, it sounds like a small number, but then you get into the habit of every time there's a turn, you're replacing these cheap mini blinds, and that adds up over time.
Yeah, if you've got a 5-unit property and they each have, 5 or 10 windows and you're replacing it every time. I've never thought about that. But I will say what I have seen on many occasions is you drive by a home and the mini blinds are, crumpled by the door where they have bent them to look out, or an obvious child or a pet has gotten a hold of them, or
yeah. And so there's many times, maybe it's better off not to even have them. Right. So, but that, especially depending on the rent you're commanding in your neighborhood, maybe it doesn't even make sense to have many blinds in there. But I ended up spending, whether it was paint, the type of paint I bought, it's cheaper to put 2 coats of, Lowe's Basic, than it is Benjamin Moore, of course, and nobody cares, the types of cabinet I chose. There's just no payoff, right? And so we finally learned our lesson that, if you go to the back wall at Lowe's, they have cabinets, basic cabinets that you can buy off the shelf, and you make the kitchen fit the size of the cabinets that are available and on the rack and cheap, right? There's no reason to try to build the kitchen and, make it 2% more functional, but you have to end up doing a special order on a cabinet. There's a zillion examples of stupid things that I did, and I just hate for people to make those.
That's a whole other podcast episode.
Yeah, that's just a stupid mistakes podcast. But there's just things I never recouped that investment. I lost it, and it took me a long time, but I finally learned the lesson.
Well, I'm glad that you've learned a lesson and that you're willing to share that with all of these wonderful people who are listening, because this is kind of Chris's mess up podcast notes in a way. You do include a lot of the things that you've done wrong so that other people don't have to make those same mistakes, which, I think last time we talked about this being a very noble profession, and that's a very noble act of you to share all this stuff. But let's talk about some specifics. Let's talk about, when you're trying to decide.
You got to, again, like I said, you got to think about what a prospective tenant wants, needs, expects. And also to a huge degree, again, this goes back to the neighborhood, what are competing properties offering? You don't want to go above that. You don't want to go below that. And the true message on this is you got to rely on facts, and you can't rely on your personal emotions or magical thinking. It's like you said, you're not going to, be living in that rental property that you own, right? You're not the person that's going to move into that property. So it's critical to think about, and get yourself okay with the fact that what might not be acceptable for you and your family is perfectly acceptable and in some degrees aspirational for, your target tenant or your target applicant. If you have a property in the higher end, though, think about this for a minute, because I always tend to veer to the lower end because that's where, people tend to gravitate because the purchase prices are lower, or investors tend to gravitate. But, if you go to a higher end neighborhood, that $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 range, you have to be competitive, right? You have to not just meet, but it may make more sense to go above and beyond, to command rent, especially if you're in a place where rents are going up. So that's the one place where I think it's critical that you do keep up with the Joneses, right? It's a different investment. The other place where, some fancy wow factor amenities can really pay off is if you're investing in short-term rental properties, like in vacation destinations, or, here in Columbus, there's a lot of short-term rentals around the Ohio State University that get booked up years in advance, during Ohio State football season. And any wow items that you can add and feature in your Airbnb page there, those will pay for themselves. So, there are investment strategies that do require you to think about, well, this is what I want in a property. And in that case, you probably should go with your gut. But when you're going the other direction and you're providing safe, basic, adequate housing at a fair price, you just want to guard against that sort of inclination.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point because because again, that's where my family's investments are. I think about, lower end, I think you called them C and D neighborhoods earlier, and I've lived in some of those neighborhoods because I lived in some of these properties. So there's no judgment there, but there are folks who really gravitate towards the kind of this style of rehabbing, and I think it's important to think about that when you're building that overall investment strategy. But yeah, so what are some examples of the amenities that tenants in high income neighborhoods or some of these Airbnbs might expect out of a property?
I think you want to go with upscale kitchen appliances. This is where you need your fancy designer colors or your stainless steel. You want to upgrade the cabinets. You want to have them have that luxury feel, that they close themselves.
Soft close. Everybody loves the soft close.
You're looking at granite countertops. You're looking at premium flooring. Big spa-like bathrooms, high-end light fixtures, and these are furnished. So obviously you want to have quality furniture, but by the same token, you also want furniture that is going to hold up and it's going to be easy to clean, especially in a short-term rental where you've got, people passing through there every single week, and it could be very hard on the furniture. But the other place where people really are looking for these days is, I even use the term luxury outdoor living, right? Decks and entertainment spaces and, down in Florida, pools and hot tubs and so forth. Those are the things that people are looking for when they go on vacation. So, I have investments on the lower end, and, we have a couple of houses in Florida that we rent out and in Airbnb. And yeah, you got to put a different hat on when you're thinking about improving different properties.
Yeah. I know that's what my family always looks for is the spaces. We can even scrunch in on the inside, honestly, if it's got a really dreamy, which we live near the mountains in North Carolina. So we spend a lot of time up there. And we can squeeze everybody into maybe not quite enough bedrooms as long as there is a place outside to enjoy the weather and the views. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely real life there. Another area, though, where I think it might be smart to really consider your investment level is the capital improvements, right? So I don't think you want to, definitely there's a neighbor. How does the neighborhood standard apply to capital improvements to your space, like your big major reno?
First of all, capital improvement is a significant improvement to your property that you end up taking a tax deduction for depreciation over time. These are big things. They're not routine things. These are your your initial major rehabs, like on the 5 unit I was just talking about. These are
the things that you're setting aside 20% of your rent every month to cover eventually, right? Like these are those expenses.
Yeah, you've got to have reserves, not just for maintenance, but you have to have reserves for future capital improvements. Every 20 years or even shorter in Florida, you've got to replace a roof. Windows have to be replaced, from time to time. I mean, windows last quite a while, but when you're fortunate enough to buy a lower priced property, the windows tend not to have been replaced. So to replace windows is a capital improvement.
Yeah, we just had a guy come by and quote us for windows and siding and doors. And I bought my house for my family and I got a great buy on it. I also bought at a time when, the market wasn't super inflated and I got a great rate on my mortgage. So all in all, this guy came out and quoted us. This is a perfect example of a neighborhood standard not being addressed. And his quote for siding, windows, and doors on my 1,200 square foot home was about $5,000 less than I paid for the home itself. So he clearly did not have the neighborhood standard in mind.
Well, it's like you can pay for Pella windows, but unless you're in a house where people are looking for Pella windows, there's really no point. You can get great windows at a lot of different places for, a super fair price. But again, capital expense, it's something that, and again, you have to talk to your tax accountant about this, but that you really shouldn't be, and you aren't really allowed to expense immediately against the property and take it off your taxes. Basically it's over 27 years or whatever the number is that you get to divide that capital expense by and take a portion of it every year through the life of the property. But at some point, I'll tell you another thing. And, honestly, I don't know if we were able to expense this or not, but, we have a lot of older properties in Springfield, Ohio, and we had a rash a couple of years ago. I had at least three houses where the sewer lines or the water lines went bad. You we had to dig up the yard and everything. It was $5,000-$6,000 a pop. And, sadly, those things you don't get to expense out immediately, or at least I wasn't advised to do that. And they have to be, depreciated out over time. But at some point, making capital improvements is going to be unavoidable, whether you make it at the time that you buy the property or some point during the life cycle of the investment. So you've got to get comfortable and build your budget conservatively so that, when that rainy day comes, and they always do come eventually, that you're ready for it. And, thinking about improvements, and I guess I'm just going to rant for a second if you'll let me.
I'm listening.
I am all about landlord profitability. There's just no point in messing around with this if you're not going to be profitable. But so many landlords put off capital investments or just refuse to do them. And again, this is my personal rant, but there is no room in this business, for cutting corners, hiding defects, trying to rent properties in poor condition and get neighborhood standard price. Or in some cases, these people are trying to get even more than that for a property that they haven't done a thing to. And, that is the definition of a slumlord. That term gets thrown around, and I hate the term, but I have to say, I know where it comes from. If you haven't set yourself up, or you just flat out refuse, that you're going to make any improvements to a property to make it safe and so forth, or the neighborhood standard, then you are a slumlord. And we don't manage for slumlords. All of our properties are maintained and managed to the neighborhood standard. And if we have an owner who's not willing to do that or not able to do that, we have to part ways. And our property management agreements, they all say that either one of us, whether it's us, we the property managers, or they the owners, can terminate the relationship by giving one another a 30-day notice. And there have been many times whether we took on an owner that we shouldn't have, which, another one of Chris's mistakes, or we had an owner that we thought was, going to do the right thing, and it turned out they didn't. And we've had to, let them go. But our company values, dictate that our properties and the properties we manage more, that they're clean, they're move-in ready, they're functional, the lights work, the furnaces, the electric's safe. And at the end of the day, that's what tenants deserve. And sometimes there are capital expenses involved in getting to that.
Yeah, I think that you've always said you're in the shelter business, right? So yeah. That's part of it, is you're in business not just with the owners, but with the tenants. So I think that's a standard that that I'm proud of for Roost, and I know you're really proud of it too. But there are some advantages too to this kind of neighborhood standard mindset, and that's one of those. I think is that it gives you kind of a checklist, right? You don't have to think so much about what you're doing to these properties because you're doing the same thing to each one. I know in a past conversation, which I'm sure you'll talk about this, is you now have a paint and a carpet and a type of cabinet that you go to readily when it's time to rehab a property, within a certain neighborhood standard. So if you're in B neighborhoods, then it's these. If you're in a C neighborhood or an A neighborhood, it's these. And so, I love that. It's like a checklist. What's the checklist for these kind of amenities for rental properties in kind of low to mid income areas?
Well, here's some things to consider, and not all of these are going to be appropriate, but I think almost all of them are. But, if you're going to offer appliances, they have to be functional and affordable. We have owners that are continuously looking for deals at used appliance stores, for instance. I have never, ever, and I used to try to do that too. And every time I would buy a used appliance, it was cheaper than going to Lowe's, but, it only lasted 6 months, right? So, I found that if I do have a property where I'm going to offer appliances, then I put new ones. Right.
Yeah, like a new white appliance is better than a used stainless steel appliance.
And,
that's a general rule, right?
They're not going to have ice makers, and it's just going to be a basic, refrigerator box. But functional and affordable appliances, laminate or vinyl flooring, some storage solutions, closets with shelves in them, exterior lighting too. From a safety standpoint is critical. And if there's common areas, if we're talking about an apartment building or a multi-unit, maintaining the common areas and the parking areas, some of the basic stuff, many houses, the old toilets, replace the toilets, at a minimum, replace the seat. It's funny, a lot of these old houses, they have tiny toilets relative to what you pick up at those today for a new toilet. So, you want to rent the property, spring for a new toilet. The other thing
that's the Easter egg of the whole podcast.
Yeah, spring for a new toilet.
This far and heard this, you've won something.
Yeah. And then, handicapped accessible, bathtub grab bars, for instance, that's something that everybody's going to appreciate. A mom with small kids, an older person, whatever, that's something that is never going to, be destroyed. And it's something that is going to enhance the property for a little bit of money. Many people these days have pets, dogs. And if you restrict, all of your properties to people with no pets, more power to you. I respect that. But, on the other hand, there's an argument for, making your properties pet friendly. So if there's a partial fence, maybe both neighbors, on either side have a fence up, and maybe it's in your interest to fence off the backside at your expense and get the whole yard secure, installing gates that can be secured if gates are missing. I can't tell you how many houses I see where there's fences, but the gates have been torn off years ago. Storm doors, yes, I know storm doors get torn off, but you can also get a quality storm door at any type of storm door. And if it's installed correctly, it's less likely to be torn off. But, there's something to be said for being able to open the front door and let some light into a property. I don't ever expect anybody to put a washer and dryer, in a property and offer those, but at a minimum, if there's any way at all that you can get washer and dryer hookups in your property in the basement or in someplace else in the house, that's going to help you rent your property for top dollar for years to come. I don't care what neighborhood you're in. Nobody likes to have to pack up and go to the laundromat. And that's why apartment complexes that, tend to have, washer and dryer common areas in them. But washer and dryer hookups, I think that's a great investment. A new mailbox and house numbers. I won't say it's exactly like a new toilet, but if there's something fresh when you walk in, I think that goes a long way.
Now we've moved from flip this house to curb appeal is the show we're on now.
Yeah. And, like we talked about windows, in Ohio, vinyl replacement windows are a huge selling point. And there's so many people who skip that. But again, Home Depot, Lowe's, local sources, there's still some places to get affordable windows. Here's another thing, and I think this is something that really helps you rent properties anywhere, but clean the basement, get the cobwebs out of the rafters in the basement, paint the walls, paint the floor, paint the stairs, make sure the stairs are set up with railings, and you can actually get down to the basement so somebody could use it for storage or whatever. It just goes a long way to show that, you care and you took the time to do the entire house when you do a rehab. This is something that it's just one of those little things, but I absolutely believe it matters. When you're doing the basement, clean off and the furnace and the water heater, right? Make them look like they're, if not brand new, make them look like that they've been maintained. And obviously you want to maintain them as the owner, but, maybe touch up paint's a little bit too far. But, I've seen some grungy, corroded, just flat out filthy, dirty water heaters and furnaces that look like they're on their last legs. So if that's what you've got in the basement and the tenant sees, that's not going to help you. It's going to hurt you.
Yeah, and scare good folks, I think, away from what otherwise is a good property, because those are the types of, accidents. If you think that the water heater is going to go bad just because it looks bad, then that's a huge pain for a renter, even though they don't own the property and they're not going to be responsible necessarily for fixing it or cleaning it up, but it's going to be a real pain in their life for sure. So those things can scare people away, I think. But like this checklist kind of thing, it saves time more than anything, I feel like, right?
Well,
so like time is money.
efficient.
Your time is worth money, right?
So whether you're managing for yourself or, what we do for others, you basically only have to make those decisions once. So you don't have time to make a decision for every unit. We just want to do what works. So, and, sort of the wrapped up this section, you're going to save a lot of money in the long run by ensuring that whatever updates you make are going to last. So we're focused on longevity and quality. And that's where I learned my lesson in cheap vinyl mini blinds, right? We're looking to do things that are going to last from tenant to tenant. Sometimes it's tempting to buy more expensive materials and make, changes that you think could bring in money, but they likely won't. But just go be cost effective, go for value, prioritize longevity and quality over extravagance. In a nutshell, don't spring for granite countertops when basic Formica is going to work.
Yeah, so that's what we had talked about in a past conversation in one of our sessions was, the saving money when choosing updates and amenities. You just pick what works and then you follow through with that. And that's where we were talking about paint and hard floors versus carpet, right?
Yeah. So as paint every room the same color. Don't just because you have an extra can of paint laying around that's a different color, it's not going to be worth it. Paint every room the same color. It's going to save you time and money down the road on touch-ups, and maybe you don't have to repaint the whole unit when somebody moves out. Maybe you just have to do a room, or if you're lucky, maybe you don't even have to do the entire room, as long as you're always using the same color paint in the unit over the years and in every unit that you have. Think about affordability, think about durability, whether you're talking about fixtures, countertops, or flooring. You want to look for the sharpest look that you can get without overspending. I think they call it LVT, luxury vinyl. It's like, it looks like hardwood floors, like but it's a man-made material. Yeah. That is a great long-term investment. Yeah, it's very durable. You can get it easily in basic colors. And I always urge our owners, we're trying our best to get away from carpet altogether. And that can be expensive though. And, sometimes you can't do it all at once, but especially if you have a property where you have pets, going to the expense and time to refinish hardwood floors that are going to last for years, maybe an extra coat of poly from time to time, or putting LVT into, floors so that you don't have to keep spending money over and over on carpet, or shampooing carpet is going to save you a ton of money down the road. And it's like, just to reiterate, those cabinets on the back wall of Lowe's and Home Depot, those are the key. Buy mass manufactured cabinets and hardware. Don't buy unique sizes or whatever. Don't try to buy used cabinets and make them fit. Just get the package that works in that kitchen, the first time. The same ones every time, good quality. They're going to last. And the other cool thing is, a lot of those back walls cabinets, if a door breaks off, you can buy a door. If the drawer goes bad, you can buy a drawer, right? You don't have to replace the entire cabinet. Sometimes you can actually buy parts. And one of the other things too, that, other kind of cost-effective upgrades, install energy efficient lighting fixtures. And here's another trick. And again, I don't care which, what your price range is, for the property, but you know how now, Laci, you can go out and buy light bulbs and the colors don't match anymore?
Oh, I do. I so do. It's one of my pet peeves as a human being. I was going to say as a homeowner, but really just as a human.
Yeah. So, you make sure you buy the same light bulb in the same color, and put them in every room and get enough wattage that it lights up the room. I was talking to our team in Columbus the other day, and we were going over the rental report that shows how many days a rental property's been up for rent and it hasn't rented yet. And I had one that was well over 30 days. And I said, what is going on with this? Who's seen it? And they said, oh, it's just dark. It's just so dark.
Let there be light.
People walk in and literally they get the creeps, and they turn around and leave. So what do you got to do there? So, well, maybe that's where you don't want any wall cover or window coverings, right? You want to get light in there. But, let's say somebody looks at the property and it's dusk or after dark, you go ahead and spring for the light bulbs and make sure they all match, make sure they're bright, maybe put something on a timer so, things come on, whatever. But energy efficient lighting fixtures, and just from a renting perspective, just make sure that they all match and that they all work. Landscaping, right? Durable, low maintenance. You're not really looking to, I don't want to say you want to enhance the curb appeal, but you know what? If the neighborhood standard is overgrown and grungy, then don't be that standard, right? You can keep the grass mowed.
This is the time when it's okay to overachieve a little.
Just doing the right thing and be above the neighborhood standard. And, this isn't the place to go out and buy bushes or to do this and that. The tenants just are not going to take care of them as you might, and it's just going to aggravate you. So durable, low maintenance, but keep the grass cut, keep the foundation, weed whacked and clean. Another thing to think about are programmable thermostats. Some tenants are going to appreciate that. Maybe some of them won't, but, at a minimum, you can set it up the way, you want them set up, before you rent the property. But again, try to choose affordable materials that look good, but will hold up over the long term.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point about the programmable thermostats and the energy efficient lighting. And because things are constantly changing, right? And so there's this neighborhood standard, and then there's where everybody wants to live, like one day, it has stainless steel appliances and granite countertops. Like, I don't think there are many folks out there looking to rent who wouldn't like to have that stuff if it were available. They just maybe don't have the budget for it. So, but things are constantly changing. Like, all of our light bulbs are the same because we have Alexa light bulbs. So we can say, Alexa, turn on the bedroom lights, which will probably happen now. But how do you know? How do you know what, the neighborhood standard is maybe not quickly changing, but it is constantly changing, I feel like. So how do you know and keep your finger kind of on the pulse of that neighborhood standard?
That's interesting that you say that, because we are seeing, especially in Columbus and Florida, where the markets are vibrant and the economy is incredible right now, that there's a lot of neighborhoods that are improving right before our eyes. And you're right. As the values of the neighborhood goes up, as the rent rates go up, you do have to kind of reassess, what is it appropriate to add on to these properties right now. But, I think the key is that you need to partner with a local property manager that is involved in sales also, but knows their rental rates, knows what things are selling for, can help you, do your return on investment calculations, figure out your cap rate, things like that. But a property manager with local market knowledge can give you insights to, neighborhoods, tenant preferences, the whole thing. They can help advise you and help you, collaborate with you to make decisions on, cost-effective updates and, the amenities that align with your target tenant demographic, whether it's, long-term or, if you're doing a short-term furnished Airbnb rentals. But, a good property manager can help you optimize your budget, set your expectations for what's going to happen financially with that property appropriately over time, and also help you recommend where to buy in the first place. So again, like everything else in this business, having somebody whose entire life's work is real estate and knowing, how much things are and what things sell for and what things rent for, that's the key. If you can find that person or that property management team, you're going to do much, much better over time. No question.
Yeah,
And yes, I am
this is where the
partial because
Chris's
it's
mistakes podcast comes into play, I guess.
and I am partial because that's what we do for a living. But I can't tell you how many, people who have bought properties on their own, managed them on their own to the point where they can't anymore, and then they come to us, and we're happy to do it, but they hire us to, put things back together for them. So, we do that as well.
Yeah, it'd be great if you just didn't have to put anything back together and you just went that way right out of the gate, I guess, right? Not a sales pitch, just me making an observation.
All right. So I think we hit the high points today, but I guess maybe it's time to sum up a little bit.
Yeah, I think this has been, again, always insightful, but I think this time in particular, we've gone over a lot of really specific information that it is almost like a checklist. Like if you took this with you and we'll transcribe it and put it up, and then people can use it to literally go down the list and check off and make sure they have a large toilet with a new seat and exterior lighting and all the things.
But, I guess in closing, choosing amenities for rental properties, it doesn't have to cost a fortune, and it really shouldn't, and it's true that some investment properties that, you'll purchase or you maybe you want to purchase, they're going to need maybe some more work than others, for needed upgrade dates, maintenance, amenities, repairs. But again, and I know I sound like a broken record, but it's critical. You've got to focus on the neighborhood standards. That's going to dictate the level to which you want to improve your property and maintain it to for the rest of the life cycle of that property. Even if you think you'd want a nicer dishwasher or a bigger outdoor space, you got to keep in mind that there's a tenant for every rental property. And the people who end up renting your property will be thrilled to live there as long as it's clean, everything's in good working order, and you're willing to make repairs as needed to ensure that it stays up to the neighborhood standards, which now includes your tenant standards. And then, a selfish plug, you've got to have the right team by your side. Managing your investment property is going to be a lot easier if you're working with a professional on the ground. They're your eyes and ears. It's just going to help you sleep better at night and make more money. That's the trick. So this one was fun.
Yeah, that's how you do it in the shelter business.
That's how you do it in the shelter business. That's right. So. All right. Well, thank you very much. We will talk to you next time. Thank you all for listening to the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast. There we have it. Thanks for listening in. If you want to continue the conversation, go to www.landlordprofitabilityplaybookpodcast.com. That's the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast.com, where we have additional information about this podcast, archived episodes, and an option you can select to be a guest on the show. We'll be back next time with another episode of the Connect, Practice, Track, and Grow podcast.